Welcome to the Ask Phil Skinny podcast with a guest. I'm proud to present Tom Szaky. Tom, welcome to the show. Please tell us more about yourself. What is your story?
Peter, thanks for having me. So I've had the privilege of running TerraCycle now for 25 years, and that's a company that's dedicated to how do we eliminate the idea of waste by recycling things that are hard to recycle, from cigarette butts to dirty diapers, and bringing out a full reuse economy where things don't even need to be recycled, but just collected, repaired, cleaned, and so on. For me, my fascination with waste began, early on when I was a freshman at college, just because, when I started thinking about the idea of waste, I found that it was filled with all these anomalies. It is something we are willing to pay to get rid of, which only garbage experiences that idea. We also today, in a very consumerist society, one where I would argue we valorize ourselves based on how much stuff we have. Isn't it interesting that 99% of what we buy becomes property of a garbage company, within the year of purchase? And garbage is incredibly modern. It was only invented about 75 years ago. And there's more and more. So it's these anomalies that really got me excited to so far dedicate my career to to building a business around how do we solve for waste.
So would you say that these anomalies are the key to success in your business? That you just have to find what is not typical. For example, you mentioned that most of the things that we have, we want to sell. We don't want uh, to pay to get rid of them. Would you say that there lies this opportunity that you took advantage of it?
Yes, I think that's so the unlocking solution to waste for me has been understanding the underlying principles, right? And one way to think about garbage is it's the only material that we don't want to sell. In fact, we don't want to sell it so bad that we would be willing to pay to get rid of it. That is sort of the first underlying point. And then the question then becomes, what drives recyclability? And in many cases, the reason a cardboard box or an aluminum can is highly recyclable in our recycling bin is because garbage companies can make money on it. The reason we can't put our bicycle helmet, our writing instrument, our pair of glasses, our juice pouch in the recycling bin, and we have to put it in the garbage bin, is that the value of the materials in those objects are lower than the cost of collecting and processing them. And suddenly that unlocks the business models to be able to solve for waste.
Would you say that the enormous amount of waste is the direct consequence of how we live? Because we know that on farms, a lot more things get recycled and reused. And it's, for example, we drive 50 and 100 years old tractors, but we have to have a 5 years old car.
Yeah. Um, so I think a big part of this is our relationship with stuff. And I think, what's interesting when we think about that question is that it really emerged a major shift in the 1950s. Before the 1950s, we didn't live in a world that produced waste the way it does because there was two things that were missing then that appeared in the 1950s. One is the innovation in materials. 100 years ago, if you and I would be chatting, our clothing would be made from cotton, wool, maybe silk. The chair we would be sitting on would be made from wood, maybe some bits of metal. If we're eating food, it would probably just be, an apple packaged in its own skin or, this sort of thing. And any of these things, our sweater, our chair, the peelings of an apple that became waste that we didn't want to consume, you could throw in the forest and the forest would have no problem. So what came about in the 1950s is this huge emergence of advanced materials, like plastics and all sorts of different things that have made life phenomenal. But today, 60% of our clothing is plastic. The chair we're sitting on is likely advanced materials. The food we eat is likely packaged in these same materials. And nature doesn't have systems for those. And then what really compounded that is these advanced materials allowed the price of goods to go down. And as a result, our consumption exploded. And today we buy 10 times more stuff than we did 100 years ago. I mean, it's crazy. Like, here's a statistic. Like, in 1920s, we would buy two apparel items per year and wear them on average for 20 years. That's back when we cobbled our shoes, we darned our socks, we mended our clothing. Today, an average person buys 66 apparel items per year and wears them on average 3 times before disposal.
Yeah,
And this is the recipe for the waste crisis we're in. But I think it's also a, psychological challenge at the very same time.
but would if we would drop waste and go back to the old ways of doing things and having one shoes for a couple of years and one trousers and stuff like that, uh, um, would you agree that then the economy, as we have set it now, with this endless growth in mind, would collapse because we would need so much less or so we could use things
Yeah, it's
so much more, but we would use you're talking about 10x uh, so increase in a number of things that we are using now, not just consuming but using. Would you think that our economy then would collapse? What's your take on it?
yeah, it's a good question. I think on the surface, there's an economic challenge that you point out. There's no question. However, I think that the economy could also shift so that you could do the same amount of consumption, but consuming different things. So if we would buy, you know, um, objects that were made to last, then we would invest more in each of those objects. So our pants, our shirt would be more expensive. We might invest then in the cost of maintenance, the cost of repair. So that would also, be investment instead of buying just a bunch of very cheap things. And maybe the extra money we have left over, we would invest in experiences or other ways. I think the money will still be spent. People are pretty good at deploying and spending money to make themselves happy. I just wonder if we need to do it on buying a huge amount of really crappy stuff. Could we maybe shift it to buying fewer, better things and then have a little left over to invest in other components of our lives?
Okay, but then the hyper production would be endangered, and that is part of our economy today. So, um, how can an average person or small company start going? Because you work with so many big companies and or all size companies in your company. But how can an average consumer in the US starts utilizing your knowledge or your experience with let's call it recycling and reuse economy as you mentioned it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing that we would start with is how do we buy? Because what we buy is a vote for the future. Whatever we buy, more will exist tomorrow, and whatever we don't buy, less will exist tomorrow. It's perhaps the most fiercely democratic function that we participate in is again what we buy and what we don't buy. So I think that's the first sort of lens. Then, in the context of what we buy, let's buy things that are going to be durable, that are made to last, that can be repaired, that we can really enjoy. Maybe invest more in those objects than buying just a lot of disposable goods. And then, of course, let's look at how do we recycle what is going to be disposed and try to avoid things that are not recyclable. And then you can always use a company like TerraCycle, like our company, to help you with those hard to recycle components that you may not have answers for. But the general point is that it begins with how we purchase.
Okay, but is that um, the convenience level of plastic and throwing things into our bin is just so high? How can we set our minds to accept the different convenience level of recycling, reusing, and stuff like that?
Well, I think there's two parts, right? I think in the so maybe three parts. One is that in reuse, you might have a slightly less convenience because you have to clean and refill, or you have to repair, and so on. But you can trade that for much higher quality goods. So you get maybe a little less convenience, but a much higher quality experience. And I think that could be worth it for for many folks. Then I think the next part is we do have to invest in making the environment better. You know, the environment we live in is tremendously important for our health, our children's health, you know, and also all the other plants and animals on the planet. And that is an investment that we have to take care of, right? And there's a little work involved in that. Um, so I think, and then the final is what's not in the individual's hands. It's companies like TerraCycle, like mine and others, need to work on trying to make these systems as affordable and as convenient as possible. And that's what we strive to do every day. It's why I'm here in the office and what we work on a daily basis.
What's your take on should consumer choose to recycle and upcycle and reuse and watch how much you said that you vote with your purchase. Should recycling or transferring to more or 100% recycling, should that be a consumer choice or should that be regulated by the government?
Oh, I mean, look, any and all regulations are good, right? That move society into being more responsible. So every time regulation occurs and forces us to be better, I think it's wonderful. Now, in the world of garbage, there's only one regulation today, which is you and I in the US are not allowed to put garbage on the street. We can't litter. That would be illegal. But that's the only regulation that exists. Everything else is voluntary. Whether we compost at home is voluntary. Whether we choose to recycle, whether we choose to reuse, these are all voluntary functions. Let's remember the only regulated function is you cannot litter. That's it. In Europe, for example, it has that, but it goes beyond where you cannot landfill in many countries. You must, at minimum, incinerate for energy recovery. So any form of regulation is good, but the reality is regulations are very difficult to implement. As you can see in the reality in the past, 75 years since garbage has emerged, only one regulation like this has really been a global standard, which is anti-litter laws. So I think we have a long way to go on regulation, and we certainly cannot wait for regulation because generally regulation is about sort of enshrining things in law that are already popular, right? It's not going to be something that if we sit back and say we're going to wait for regulation, that is going to save us. So regulation is good, but it's very slow.
Okay, so to our listeners, where should they start? What is the number one priority or task that they should undertake in order to stop, let's call it, or consume it and producing too much waste?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the beginning is it's effectively turning off the faucet, which means we um, buy less things, and we buy things that have longevity, things that make us happier over time, and things that can then be reused or recycled. I think the most important beginning part is how we purchase. From there, it's then what do we do at the end of life of these objects, and making sure that we can reuse them or recycle them. But the beginning is the most important. It's how we purchase.
Okay, so let's touch a bit about to our topic we touched in preparation phase before the podcast. So what do you think? How could we relate uh, burnout and avoiding burnout with recycling? Because we know that this over consuming or excessive consumption brings to excessive money that we have to spend, and then we have to earn this money, and that leads to the burnout. So
Mm.
how can your or the things that you are proposing, choose what you buy, help us eliminate or avoid burnout?
It's a really good question. I think you've made a really good point here. If our burnout is linked to our requirement to work, right? Like that we feel we have to work and work and work to be able to afford our lifestyle, what we're talking about here could be a real foundational solution, which is the best thing to do is buy less. that is the essence of how do we bring the earth into balance. Because today we talk about garbage, but it doesn't matter. If you talked about climate change, if you talked about deforestation, about species diversity loss, pick any vector from an environmental point of view that is going poorly, and that most of them are, they are all linked to us voting for them by buying things. And if we buy less, we intrinsically take care of the planet more, and we have less requirement to go work, which would then strain us less. And also, when we buy things, those things then have to be dealt with, maintained. They have to be in our minds. They have to be thought about, right? And this is why there's a great beauty, if you will, of minimalism, I think, both from an environmental point of view, but also from a mental health point of view. And I think this is a great start. And then after that, we can think about, okay, what we buy, how do we recycle it? How do we reuse it? How do we steward those materials and make sure we honor them by having them go around?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for all these insights, and thank you for me being my guest tonight. Before we leave, please let our listeners and viewers know where they can get in touch with you.
Absolutely. It's a real pleasure, Peter, to talk to you today. And you can learn more about TerraCycle by visiting terracycle.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn and so on. But our website's a great beginning point to learn about the types of things that we do.
Tom, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Really appreciate your time.